give a business person's perspective of one of the reasons that healthcare costs have restrained is over 31 years as I bought health insurance for the people who work with me, as we went to higher and higher deductibles, instituted health savings accounts that put people in charge and involved in the consumer decisions, I think that's certainly had an impact. One thing I'd like to do is I do have one slide. As a manufacturer, I certainly learned how to solve problems. The first step in solving a problem is you admit you got one. The second step is properly define it. Now, what we've tried to do, and CBO has been somewhat helpful, but not as helpful as I'd like them to be, but we've used their alternate scenario here, which is really, if you take a look at the assumptions here, pretty reasonable. Tax cuts for people making less than $250,000 continue, and we basically enacted that. AMT patches, doc fixes, all these things continue. As we've taken their percentage GDP figures, which is incomprehensible. I mean, I'm sorry, we all talk about it, but nobody understands it, and tried to turn that into dollars. What we've come up with is about $100 trillion of deficit spending over the next 30 years. Now, 30 years is not a very long time period. My eldest child just turned 30. It went by in a heartbeat. We don't have a 10-year budget window problem. You can see that. The deficit over the next 10 years is about $5 trillion. We have a 30-year demographic problem. We have a bunch of baby boomers retiring, rate of 10,000 per day. We've made all these promises to them, and we did not make adequate provision to pay them. And that puts us in a real pinch. So if you take a look at what I've tried to do is do this 30-year projection, and I know, Senator King, I appreciate you willing to hear me out on this. We've tried to set up in a format where we're not dealing with that many numbers, but we're dealing with numbers so people can understand it. I think people can take a look at this and go, boy, $100 trillion, by the way, that exceeds the net private asset base of the United States today. But you can also kind of see where the problem lies. You've got about $14–15 trillion in Social Security benefits that exceed what we take in the payroll tax. You've got about $35 trillion of Medicare payments, benefits that exceed what we take in a payroll tax. Then the rest is just other deficit spending, if you want to define it that way. So, from my standpoint, I'd like to start with a couple questions. Mr. Rosenberg, you were talking about labor force participation. And talking about educating the public. I couldn't agree more with you. Very interesting that Canada limits right now, their spending is relationship to GDP is 15%. Ours had peaked over the last couple of years at 25%, not historically peaked, but in the relatively short term, 25%. We're down to 20, but we're on a trajectory to hit 30, 35%, depending on what projections you're looking at. You quote, and I'm also aware of the fact that in the last 5 years, we've gone from people out of the workforce from about 81 million to 92 million, increase 11 million individuals. Now, some of those are those retiring baby boom generations. Do you have that broken down at all? Have you ever seen where that breaks down? I mean, how many are retiring? How many should potentially be in the workforce?
Well, I don't have the numbers broken down, but the data from the BLS, from the household survey, are fairly detailed. So the data aren't that difficult to obtain. But I think that when you take a look, and it's what I said before, that even if you take a look at the prime-aged adult cohort, say that 25 to 54-year cohort, people have been leaving the labor force there as well, though those aren't retirees. And I think the one area where I disagree with Mark Zandi is that this isn't about discouraged workers. That's what's incredible, is that in the prime-aged cohort, the number of people that have left the labor force that say they're discouraged are actually down 20%. There's something else at work here.
We had an incredibly interesting witness here, the head of the welfare department in Pennsylvania, and he did a study on a single mom who we've got a great deal of sympathy for. But he showed that basically up to $26,000 of earnings, it was marginally beneficial for her to continue to work. Past that point, because of decrease in benefits and increase in taxes, she basically was facing a marginal tax rate of 100% until her earnings got into the $60,000 range. I mean, have you seen studies, and could it be one of the reasons people are leaving the labor force is we incentivize them not to work at a certain point?
Well, there have been studies, some rather controversial, which have shown that if you do tap the myriad of benefits at every level of government, you can actually, in 39 states, apparently, you could make as much money, say, as an admin assistant. Now, as I said, these, this report in particular was controversial. I cited in the written testimony that I handed in a report, testimony by C. Eugene Sterling in February of last year to the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. It was titled, and I think this is well worth the read for everybody, it was called Labor Force Participation, Taxes, and the Nation's Social Welfare System. He did basically discuss some of the plausible explanations as to why people are falling through the cracks of the labor market as traditionally defined. And basically, one of the things that should be examined, at least this is his conclusion, was the piecemeal and inefficient manner that a lot of these, say, government subsidies are being introduced. That's one thing that the Canadian government did. At the same time, they did a whole bunch of things back in the mid-1990s, but they unbundled a lot of these social programs to make them more targeted.
Okay.
And then the final analysis, save taxpayer money.
You know, Senator Sessions talked about making modification to the earned income tax credit, which I believe is the best way of addressing a livable wage so that we don't actually reduce the entry-level job positions, because I think that's what happens when you increase the minimum wage. Another thing we take a look at in terms of strengthening that is let's work to eliminate the 21% of improper payments in the earned income tax credit. That's one way we can strengthen it. Before I run out of time, I do want to just touch on Social Security. I think, Mr. Greenstein, you talked about the difference between public debt and total debt, and that really does speak to the trust funds. We had a very interesting testimony from CBO Director Elmendorf in our budget conference, where finally, after 4 attempts with administration officials, I was able to get Mr. Elmendorf to admit that the Social Security Trust Fund nets to zero when you consolidate the books of the federal government. You have an asset in the Social Security Trust Fund offset by the liability to the Treasury, netting to zero. And so when you take a look at these deficits, when you realize that you really have no asset, no real asset of the federal government to pay off $14, $15 trillion in Social Security, that's a real problem, isn't it?
Well, it's part of our larger long-term fiscal imbalance. The Social Security Trust Fund holds Treasury bonds that investors worldwide view as perhaps the safest investment in the world. So
when it's held in the hands of the federal government, it's the same thing as if you had $20, spent it, and then write yourself a pretty little note, put in your pocket and say, I got $20. No, you have a piece of paper that you're going to have to get somebody else to give you money, either tax people or get somebody else to buy that bond, correct?
it's part of it's good as gold for Social Security. It is not sufficient for Social Security for the next 75 years. That's why the system is projected to become insolvent in about 2033.
So who reimburses the trust fund for the $2.6 trillion?
Yeah, this is part of our larger government-wide fiscal imbalance that we need to address.
It's the federal government that has to pay the $2.6 trillion, right? So it's
yes,
got the
that's
liability asset. It has no value to the federal government. I just want people to understand, to define the problem, admit we have one, because Social Security is not solvent to the year 2033. It's running cash deficits now. It'll run cash deficits of $4 to $5 trillion over the next 30 years, and we better fix that, and Medicare is even worse. $1 going in, $3 being paid out in benefits, and around this town, nobody's, we basically have reality deniers here. Nobody's admitting we have a problem. We're not defining it properly. We're talking all these percentages and gobbledygook. We need to put some real hard numbers. We got to have the solutions laid out with the dollar value of those solutions, so we start talking about and debating these issues with real information. And that's my point.
I would just say 2 things can simultaneously be true, and this isn't a contradiction. Social Security is solvent through the early 2030s because it has these assets which will absolutely be honored. If the federal government stopped honoring Treasury bonds, whether they were U.S. investors, foreign investors, or the Social Security Trust Fund, any one of the 3, that would have catastrophic implications. But it is also true, as you're saying, that the overall federal balance sheet that includes Social Security has to be stable, and to do that, we have to have a debt-to-GDP ratio at a sustainable level that isn't rising rapidly.
Mr. Greenstein, that's going to have to be our last word, and appreciate all of our witnesses for participating today, and I want to thank all of our colleagues as well.